Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the board. After review of the supplemental instructional materials available on the TEA website, I am forced to the conclusion that they all commit the following errors in various places in various ways. They fail to examine all sides of the scientific evidence of scientific explanations as required by TEKS 3A. They all fail to significantly address many of the new biology TEKS or additions to the previous TEKS. They fail to bring the textbooks reasonably up to date with new research results, even where it contradicts the old textbook teachings. The absence of those corrections are factual errors. They continue to use the old, decades-old icons of evolution type illustrations. They're full of factual errors. For examples, the Miller-Urey experiment does not generate the required amino acids. Haeckel's embryos, the earlier stages than is typically shown, are actually divergent. They're more different as you go back than whereas the insinuation is that they're more similar, and that's just a factual error. The peppered moths, there's all kinds of talk, but they never mention the fact that there was no new species generated. Simply no new species. That's not a good illustration of evolution. Vestigial organs also. I've attached to my testimony 12 pages of 5 examples of discussions of things that can be used from new research to replace these icons of evolution type factual errors. Replace it with new research that teaches students things that should be there. If they're not there, they're missing factual errors to correct the old stuff.
All right, Mr. Mayo, thank you very much for your testimony. Board members, do we have questions? Mr. Mercer.
Mr. Mayo, thank you for being here today. So my actually ties on to there's comparative anatomy, which Darwin had, but you're talking about amino acids which become proteins, which become the cell. You're saying that comparative anatomy and comparative, if you will, biochemistry, did they complement one another?
Well, a lot of the new research where they're able to, in the last 10 years, start efficiently sequencing these proteins and DNA, when they look at that and hope that it will confirm the fossil record, they find that it does not. In fact, one protein to look at in all kinds of different animals will suggest one kind of relationship. Another protein will suggest another kind of relationship, but neither one of them confirm the fossil record. Another line of research associated with that is Dr. Gene Hunt, I believe it was. Yes. He analyzed the fossil record and the actual fossils that are there in a very large-scale statistical study. What he found that the directional change, which you normally think about in evolution, represents only 5% of the fossil record, whereas the stasis, the long strings of unchanging, represent 45% of the fossil record. It's very different from what we are typically illustrated in these books.
Another question, Mr. Mercer?
Would it be a factual error to say that the comparative anatomy always agrees with comparative biochemistry in support of evolution?
Yes, it would be false to say that.
Thank you.
It would be a factual error. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Leo.
Mr. Merrill, would you consider Haeckel's embryos to be an error, or would you consider it fraudulent?
I think it's a long...
Is this germane to talk about instructional materials?
Yes, because we are dealing with 3 instructional materials that include Haeckel's embryos, and I think there's consensus in the community that that's either error or fraudulent.
Okay, if you'll make your question short, and I believe there are 2 publishers
It's a yes
left,
or no.
So short.
I would put it this way. Haeckel's embryos were generated over 100 years ago. Approximately every 20 years since then, there have been papers in the professional peer-reviewed journals telling about the problems with what Haeckel presented, and it doesn't really represent what he claimed it did. And yet those things are still there, presented in pretty much that same way, that using modern photographs, but they're telling the same story. And to tell that same story, I think knowing that it's wrong is fraudulent.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think it's important that we understand what that context was, and perhaps it was wrong, and so perhaps they should be removed.
Okay, Mr. Mercer?
Dr. Weatherton, my question again will be about comparative anatomy versus comparative biochemistry. Comparative anatomy is what Darwin had as observations, and the phylogenies is kind of the evolutionary tree. We draw a tree to draw a common ancestor. So we had the phylogenies that he has about his evolution for comparative anatomy. And my question is, when we have phylogenies now about using biochemistry, do the phylogenies of comparative anatomy, which do support Darwin, do they always agree with the phylogenies of comparative biochemistry?
There are correlations between commonalities seen at the biochemical level and correlations seen at the developmental level, which is the embryonic level, and correlations seen at the anatomical level among adults. One sees correlations among these. There are sufficient imprecisions in scientific experimentation that make it impossible to say there is absolute certainty that each of these agrees with the others in terms of demonstrating a common ancestry. I think you'll find the same kind of disagreement in plate tectonics and the same kind of disagreement in cosmology and so forth. You don't expect 100% agreement. The point here is that with increasing knowledge of embryology, particularly with the new Evo-Devo cutting-edge approach to the genetic toolkit, we are finding more and more agreement, not less. And I think that is the point that needs to be stressed among the students. Not that we have a perfect answer, but we're having answers that more and more every year, every month, support the original contention of common ancestry.
But in terms of making sure we don't have factual errors, a statement that says that a comparative anatomy always agrees with comparative biology, that would be comparative biochemistry. That would be a factual error.
That would be a factual error if it is said always, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And I'd like to talk specifically about TEAC 2A and its application to 7G. And TEAC 2A, that requires a curriculum to explain the limitations of science. And it says students should know that some questions are outside the realm of science because they deal with phenomena that are not scientifically testable. Questions about natural history, those are outside the realm of science. Chemistry and physics curricula, they normally recognize that fact, but biology curricula often don't. And that's a big problem because unless you have a time machine or a crystal ball, you cannot go back to verify any conclusions made from historic evidence.
Questions for the testifier. Mr. Mercer?
Thank you, Mr. Ziegler, for being here. And for teaching this field, too. Again, I want to ask you, you do go through comparative anatomy, though, right, in the theory of evolution?
Yes, actually, in my seventh grade science class, we do a lot of comparative anatomy.
And do you study the phylogenies, the tree of life, if you will?
We do. We study the tree of life, yes.
And do the looking for the common ancestor?
Yes.
And you use that, I mean, I don't find that too boring, actually. And that's sort of a predictive evolution, right? You can kind of predict, using anatomy, what would tie together?
Right. It's kind of both because it's part of the theory. It's used to predict what we would find in the fossil record and other places, but it's also built on evidence that's been discovered. And I think that's an area that, for example, in the supplemental materials, it's left at just kind of a low level, just like here's the fact, here's the tree, when it could be presented as a way to analyze and evaluate and critique a theory, because the original predictions are based on organism body plans, which are called morphologies. And now as research has improved and we've gotten better, some of those predictions have been falsified by molecular studies, but we learn more things and build new trees and that kind of thing. And that's one of the areas that I'm talking about.
Exactly. That's okay. My question, to me, that's the exciting part. Darwin did not have the advantage of molecular biology, did not have the advantage of biochemistry, but the comparative biochemistry, as we said earlier, Dr. Weatherton, does not always agree with comparative anatomy, and that's the exciting part.
Exactly. We should take students to that point, the edge of science, at least as far as it conforms to the TEACs, and where that they can be making those connections and maybe be excited to go into that area of research themselves.
Critical thinking. Thank you, sir. Well, the reason I mentioned, because the concept that I've been hammering over and over, and it's called convergent evolution. And again, it's information about what Darwin had, which is he had anatomy, comparative anatomy. He didn't have molecular biology. He didn't have biochemistry. And I like kids to learn and be creative in their thinking when they look at convergent evolution, and they have comparative anatomy and comparative biochemistry, and they don't always agree. I want kids to ask those kind of questions, and I want kids to learn that way. I think it better prepares them for the future, and it better prepares them for the global economy.
I appreciate, wanting to look at things from different sides.
Was there a question, Mr. Mercer?
Well, I'm just asking, you mentioned about asking questions, but I'm saying now that I think those things should be in there. Those questions have been asked, and now they should be in our books.
I guess I guess my hesitation for allowing too much questioning at the high school level is that if you are only focused on the controversies, you'll never get the sound foundation that you can have before you can ask these questions. We teach our students Newton's laws of motion. We teach our students, F equals ma and all the good, F equals mg for gravity and all these good things. But it's not until they're in almost a graduate school level that they can kind of appreciate the little minute details that we have not worked out yet. And I'm not an expert in biology, so your comparative biology might be apt for high school kids. It might not be, I don't know. But I feel like too much emphasis is placed on showing the controversies of science and not showing what we know to be true right now. And especially at a high school level, when students are just grasping these concepts, if you throw too much controversy at them, I think that they lose their faith a little bit in the scientific method. And I was kind of giggling at some of the TEKs with the difference between a theory and a hypothesis. We don't make those.
Ms. Steele, let's get back to the question again.
Well,
all right. Do you have another question, sir? Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
I'm greatly concerned that the author of Princess Hall's proposed biology text, as well as others, are choosing to ignore what the most recent research has now presented. The list includes the rapid appearance of highly developed invertebrates during the Cambrian explosion with no reasonable explanation, the misleading pictures of embryos from different species that are now known to have been modified to fit the argument of common analogous structures between species, assumptions of cellular evolution that contradict the obvious evidence for a cell model that could not even in 4.5 billion years have randomly evolved into the highly organized and specialized structure that scientists have documented today. Darwin's finches presented it as different species rather than a species, which have physical changes in morphology triggered by environmental and biochemical factors, and no mention of the most recent ideas of genetic switches and transcription factors and their roles in turning on and off genes in different organs in not only individual species but all species. Once again, it seems that the authors of textbooks are presenting a single dogmatic viewpoint of evolution laden with errors and not allowing our students to critically analyze or question the arguments presented for evolution. Texas educators need to have the most accurate textbooks that reflect what hundreds of scientists know today, not biased opinions of scientists still clinging to biology they learned as truths in textbooks that today fall short of the most accurate research, knowledge, and good science. Respectfully submitted, Pierre G. Velasquez.
Thank you, Jonathan.
In my own particular field, healthcare, we are governed by a theory and critical thinking. That theory is the germ theory of disease. How many would be willing to throw that theory out simply because it's merely a theory? It's governed by laws, postulates. But how many wish to revert to the medicine of the 1880s simply because it's a theory?
I'd like to remind the board that when it is deviated even an iota from known science, that they've been clobbered. The most obvious example is we've had twice now today brought up the notion that the Miller-Urey experiment does not fully explain the prebiotic production of amino acids. Additional data since the last time I've talked to you continues to confirm this scientific fact, and for you to even countenance this in the future is just wrong.
Is your background, is it cell, proteins, amino acids? Is that what you're talking about?
Synthetic organic chemistry. So we could make proteins, we can make small molecules, natural products is primarily what we focus on. So I would say at the chemical level, which is why I've focused only on this particular TEKS, because it is chemistry and not biology.
So when I talk about comparative anatomy versus comparative biochemistry, would you support that then?
Would I support what?
Comparing the phylogenies, the evolutionary tree, we have one tree that is comparative anatomy, but there's different trees that are comparative biochemistry. Should the kids learn about those trees also?
Are you asking something other than what I've talked about here? I would say I really don't have an opinion on that.
My lab, consisting of about 15 individuals, has at least 3 current or very recent members who are creationists. You might expect that they would try to use some alternative to evolution in their work. They do not, because there is no alternative that generates useful, testable hypotheses.
I'm the former budget chairman of public education, the chairman for budget and oversight of public education of the Texas House of Representatives, former research director of the Senate Education Committee, but I'm here today on my own behalf. I would ask very strongly that you consider very carefully what you do here today. Actions of this board in the past have made Texas a laughing stock around the country, and that's no laughing matter.
I've been given permission to speak for Dr. Mani Dozier, who is not able to be present. Ready?
Go ahead.
In 2009, the Texas State Board of Education adopted new TEKS requiring critical scientific evaluation of the core tenets of Darwinian evolution as well as other scientific theories. Publishers were then tasked with developing such instructional materials for students to enhance the critical review of Darwinian evolution and other scientific theories. I am concerned that most publishers failed in meeting these TEKS requirements. Materials submitted by many publishers fail to outline methods for critical scientific evaluation of Darwinian evolution and other scientific theories. Many of the core Darwinian constructs are presented as facts rather than scientific findings that students should critically review. These include, but are not limited to, the explanation of the tree of life, the Miller-Urey experiments, and the transitional fossil record and Archaeopteryx. Rather than presenting the strengths and weaknesses of each of these constructs, most publishers present these as factual. Students should be allowed to study the evolution theory from all angles, employ the scientific method to thoroughly review evolutionary theory, and make appropriate conclusions based on their findings. Many of the publishers have introduced bias to the scientific debate by presenting evolutionary constructs as facts rather than as theory requiring further investigation. Such bias effectively nullifies a complete and unbiased scientific evaluation of evolutionary theory. How can we expect to develop critical thinkers when we fail to allow them to carefully analyze the best available science-based information, make inferences regarding such information, and draw conclusions that are supposed to be supported by the results of their analysis? In addition, I believe that all theories associated with the formation of the universe, our Earth, and the rise of species should be presented to our high school students as part of their study of evolution. Theories should be placed under critical review by high school students, and students allowed to draw conclusions based on their finding as they study all available scientific evidence. The beauty of science is grounded in questioning those things around us and exploring concepts not yet explained. When we provide the tools for students to open their eyes and minds to scientific discovery, we are laying the foundation for the next generation of great scientists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Orrin Nelson, followed by Richard White, followed by Walter Bradley.
In light of earlier testimony, I feel compelled to point out a few facts. First of all, a fact is a point of data which is either not in dispute or is indisputable. It is a fact that evolution happens, that biodiversity and complexity do increase, that both occur naturally according to the laws of population genetics amid environmental dynamics. It is a fact that alleles vary with increasing distinction in reproductive populations and that these are accelerated in genetically isolated groups. It is a fact that natural selection, sexual selection, and genetic drift have all been proven to have a predictable effect in guiding this variance, both in scientific literature and in practical application. It is a fact that significant beneficial mutations do occur and are inherited by descendant groups, and that several independent sets of biological markers do exist which trace these lineages backwards over myriad generations. It is a fact that birds are a subset of dinosaurs in the same way that ducks are a subset of birds, and that humans are a subset of apes in exactly the same way that lions are a subset of cats. It is a fact that the collective genome of all animals has been traced to its most basal form through reverse sequencing, and that those forms are also indicated by comparative morphology, physiology, and embryological development, as well as through chronologically correct placement in successive stages revealed in the geologic column. It is a fact that every organism on Earth has obvious relatives either living nearby or evident in the fossil record, and that the fossil record holds hundreds of clearly transitional species, even according to the strictest definition of that term. It is a fact that both microevolution and macroevolution have been directly observed and documented dozens of times, both in the lab and in naturally controlled conditions in the field, and that these instances have always stood critical analysis in peer review. It is also a fact that evolution is the only explanation of biodiversity with either evidentiary support or measurable validity, and that no would-be alternative notion has ever met even one of the criteria required of a scientific theory.
Questions from board members? Dr. Soto.
Mr. Nelson, I appreciate your recitation of a number of facts connected with this particular scientific theory. Let me read to you the way that scientific theory is defined by the science teaks in a number of locations, and I'll ask if you agree or disagree with this definition of scientific theory. Scientific theories are based on natural and physical phenomena and are capable of being tested by multiple independent researchers.
That's correct.
Thank you.
They are also a field of study that encompasses laws, theories, and hypotheses.
Okay, other questions? Mr. Mercer.
Mr. Nelson, thank you for being here today. And my question still goes into, are you familiar with convergent evolution?
Yes, I am. I have a 5-part series called Falsifying Phylogeny that you may be interested in on YouTube, the final episode of which addresses your many times repeated question today about phylogeny and how the morphology versus the chemistry matches up at least 80% of the time. And the curious thing is, even when they don't match, they match. When, for example, we found out that bats were not in the category that we thought that they were in an allied category. It was a confirmation, a genetic confirmation that still placed them in the same ballpark, in the same arena, still supported the same tree. Different branch than what we thought, but very close. So even the discrepancies, the correction of errors that was suggested earlier, would have itself been an error in that it would have been misleading. It would have implied the simple statement that they don't always match, left alone and not clarified, would lead one to believe that it was inconsistent. It is not.
But the statement that says that, again, comparative anatomy always matches comparative biochemistry, that is a factual error.
It would be a factual error to say that it was 100%. It would not be a factual error to say that it was greater than 80% accuracy.
And one more question. Are you familiar with myoglobin and insulin and those tests in biochemistry?
No, I'm not.
Okay, I apologize. Thank you then.
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Richard White, followed by Walter Bradley.
I'm going to read Richard White's testimony, who is unable to be here. Richard's a teacher, a science teacher. He says, "For the record, I testified for the SBOE public hearing in spring of 2009 and fielded questions or two for the board at that time. I am also qualified to teach any 8 through 12 science class in Texas. I was dismayed to learn that the publishers of science textbooks apparently believe that they can disregard the standards established by the Texas State Board of Education and its revised Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, and still sell their wares to us."
In 2009, we spent days, if not months, debating, voting, and writing standards for Texas students. Once again, these publishers have ignored our collective investment of time, talent, and money on behalf of our Texas children. For the past 10 years, we have had a strengths and weaknesses standard. However, if one were to review the curriculum taught in the 9th grade, especially in biology, one would be hard-pressed to find any weaknesses, much less a competing theory.